The financial market is always leaving behind these little clues, like digital breadcrumbs. And what's really wild is that if you know how to follow them, you can actually get a sense of where it's headed next. Today, we're going to dive into a pretty incredible study that shows us exactly how to find these hidden signals. So let's just jump right in with a question that I admit sounds a little nuts. Can a simple weather forecast really predict a company's stock price a full week out? Well, according to a groundbreaking new study from MIT, the answer is surprisingly yes. So let's unpack how on earth that's even possible. All right, so think of this as a digital detective story. To unravel this whole mystery, the first thing we need to wrap our heads around is the crazy amount and variety of data these researchers were digging through. Now, the big idea here wasn't just to look at one thing, like the weather. No, the real genius of this whole approach was about mashing up data from 10 completely different places. Because it's in that intersection where all these different streams of information cross that you find the connections everybody else is missing. And when I say variety, I mean it. I mean, the toolkit they used is just mind-blowing. Sure, you've got the basics, like standard market data, but the real kickers are the unexpected sources, environmental data from open media, and get this, even tracking public sentiment from conversations on Reddit. This is some next-level digital detective work. Okay, so you've got this absolute mountain of data. How in the world do you find what actually matters? Well, this is where their secret weapon comes in, the methodology for sifting through it all. How do you find those tiny predictive signals buried under all of that noise? The answer is this really cool concept called residuals. Here's the best way to think about it. Imagine you've got all this data. First, you just strip out all the obvious stuff. For an oil company, that's the price of oil. That's the loud, obvious noise. But what's left over? These faint little whispers of information. Those are the residuals. And that is where the secrets are hiding. So the process itself is this really clever three-step method. First, you isolate all those obvious factors. You just clear out the noise. Then, step 2, you calculate what's left over, that unexplained movement we're calling the residual. And this is where the magic happens. For step 3, the researchers go hunting inside that residual space, testing to see if any of those other, supposedly unrelated data sources can actually predict what's about to happen. All right, now we're at the best part, the discoveries, the actual solved cases that this incredible method managed to uncover. This is where it gets really interesting. So, let's take a look at the oil and gas giant Petrobras. Now, basic logic tells you that the price of crude oil is what's going to drive its stock, right? Well, what the study found was that wasn't it at all. It turns out the thing that actually predicted the little movements in Petrobras' stock was the tone of news articles about a totally different company, Electrobras, an electric company, that were published a full day earlier. A signal was literally jumping from one sector to another. It's almost like it was hinting at bigger shifts in energy policy or maybe investor mood across the whole industry. And what about all that chatter on social media, places like Reddit? You always hear that it predicts the market. Well, for Petrobras, this analysis showed the complete opposite. The sentiment on Reddit was just a reaction to price changes that had already happened. It wasn't leading the conversation. It was just following along. I mean, just look at some of the craziest connections they found. News about Electrobras gives a one-day heads up for Petrobras. For the food company BRF3, the earnings of its main competitor, JBS, gives a signal 2 days out. Even the price of corn, a key cost for them, gives a 3-day lead. But honestly, the most unbelievable one is this last one right here. 7 days. A forecast for a rain anomaly in the state of Paraná had a measurable impact on BRF3 stock a full week later. A week! So why? Well, because that rain could signal potential shipping and logistics nightmares for the company down the road. A simple weather report was basically acting as a financial indicator. Just wow. So what's the big takeaway from all this? In practice, what these discoveries do is completely redraw the map of how information actually moves through an economy. It is not nearly as simple or as direct as we all think. This quote here from Marcus Burgo, the MIT researcher who led the study, just nails it. He talks about an ecosystem where informational gravity pulls on things beyond direct connections. In other words, information doesn't just travel in a straight line from point A to point B. It has its own gravity, its own pull, influencing things in ways you would just never expect. So why does all this matter? Well, it tells us that information travels along these invisible pathways we'd never even think to look for. It shows that real-world events, like a change in the weather, can have huge predictive power. It also kind of suggests that some signals, like social media buzz, might only really be useful during those crazy, high-stress moments in the market. But the biggest takeaway is this: the most obvious data isn't always the most important.
And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to chew on. If these hidden links exist, and we can find them with enough data, what other invisible forces, what other hidden connections are out there shaping our world right now, at this very moment, completely beneath our notice?